I'm sure you've heard the phrase, stubborn as a mule. That phrase is describing one who is stiff-necked, dug in, resistant, obstinate, willful. And I've had people tell me the only way you can get those mules to move is with a big, sturdy 2x4. They're just unwilling to do much of anything if they don't want to. But I hear that spoken about me all the time, that I'm unwilling to budge an inch. Although stubborn is not the best quality to have in God's sight, especially when God is in the business of transforming us, trying to change us for the better. God wants each one of us to be open and willing to follow His teaching that He has for each one of us. And not to be resistant, not to be obstinate, not to be as stubborn as a mule. My Old Testament event today is Israel's 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. It's not just as a punishment, although it was a punishment, but it is also a new learning curve for them. Israel found herself in this predicament because of their lack or trust in God. God was ready to lead them right into the promised land that He had promised to give them shortly after they made that covenant with Him at Mount Sinai. They sent 12 spies out into the promised land. 40 days they spent there searching that land out. And they came back and reported how great a place it really was. It was a place of land, a land of milk and honey, which is describing its prosperity, its bounty. They brought back all the fruits. They could see it was a wonderful land. Yet 10 of the 12 told Israel that we also saw these huge fortified cities. They had these big, mighty armies. And we aren't going to be able to conquer that land. We should not go in. However, Joshua and Caleb stood up and said, listen, people, all we have to do is believe in God and we'll enter the land. He'll give us victory just like He did down in Egypt as He brought us out. If we trust God, if we follow God's leading, we will get into the promised land and we'll be triumphant and victorious. Yet Israel was too fearful, refusing to budge, dug in, and they chose not to trust God, even after all that He had showed them down in Egypt. And their just rewards for their inflexibility to follow God's leading was that older generation, that generation 20 years or older who had come out of Egypt and had saw God's power at work, that generation would not be able to enter the promised land. They had their opportunity, but they were unwilling to budge or give an inch to move forward with God into the land He had promised them. So instead, they would wander 40 years in the wilderness for their stubbornness. In that 40 years, God now could prep the next generation and provide them this learning curve to prepare them to enter the land of promise. And God is teaching them a stronger dependence upon Him. The people of Israel at that time were ingrained with dependence. But their dependence was not on God, but rather, remember, they are slaves and they were dependent on Egypt. The Pharaoh provided everything for them, their food, their work, everything. Although they were slaves, it was given to them. And it was hard for them to change. Stiff-necked is what God called them. They wanted, in fact, to quit, return, and go back to Egypt to be taken care of by Pharaoh. They couldn't bring themselves to trust in God's providence that He had for them. Even after seeing the power of 10 plagues in Egypt, even after seeing what happened on that night of Passover, even after what they saw there at the victory of the Red Sea and the Pharaoh's army covered up, they were stuck in the past. And God couldn't get them to change that. So for the next 40 years, God would teach His people this new dependence upon Him. Out in the wilderness, a barren, hot, dry wilderness, they would become hungry. But they knew nothing of the wilderness. They were slaves. They were taken care of. But God provided for them manna that fell from heaven each morning. God provided for them quail, meat to eat. And in God's provision, they ate until satisfied. Out there in the barren, hot, dry, rocky wilderness, they would get thirsty. They had no clue where to go and to look for the water. And they would get thirsty. But they learned that God provided their water from the rocks. And they drank until satisfied. And when they're out in this wilderness, this barren land, they were very vulnerable to everything out there. But they learned to trust God because God provided for them protection from all their enemies. In God, they were saved. Despite all their contentious grumbling and complaining, God was teaching Israel, who was really in charge of their lives. It was He, for He is God. Those 40 years of wandering taught them to depend on God for all their needs. And they needed to learn that dependence before they could enter the promised land. And then second, God was teaching them a stronger obedience. You would think that when the people heard the words of God spoken to them, that they would naturally obey them. Remember, last week as we learned at the covenant of Mount Sinai, that was part of the deal that they said they would do with God. They shook hands on it. That when you speak, we'll obey. But they became so obstinate that they wouldn't do it. They did what they wanted instead. Go figure. No one can be that foolish, can they? Or can they? And I'm not just talking about those people back then either. So for 40 years in the wilderness, God worked overtime to develop obedience in His people. Each morning, He told them to go out and collect a very specific measure of the manna that fell from the sky, and no more. And then on the day before the Sabbath, you are to collect twice as much, because on the Sabbath it's not going to be there. And then he says, if you collect more than that, it's going to spoil and turn putrid. And if you don't go out and collect, guess what? No food. It took them a while to get that simple instruction down, because it says there were some who were lazy and wouldn't go out, and they didn't eat. And there were others who said, well, let's just collect more because we'd have more to eat. But the extra turned putrid, and they couldn't eat it. So it took them a while to just learn to obey God's simple command. Even Moses himself learned the hard way that you could not take shortcuts with what God had commanded. You see, obedience is always in one's best interest, because God is our creator. Guess who knows us better than we know ourselves? And God really is interested in making and providing the best person he can make out of us. And Israel in this time in the wilderness learned that they couldn't pick and choose which rules or which laws that they wanted to obey. The ones they felt like or the ones they liked. No, they had to learn to obey them all. So when God said go, they took off. When God said look, they focused in. And when God said build, they built. And when God said, they were to obey. This new generation's obedience was essential to prepare them for the entrance into the promised land with confidence of victory in following God. Every instruction from God is of equal importance for the wealth, the well-being, the strength, and the faith of their community. It is the obedience of the community. And third, God was teaching them a stronger presence. Israel needed a very concrete way to see God's abiding presence was always with them at all times. He is here. They had to know that God was with them wherever they were. They could see God in the pillar of cloud by day. They could see God in the pillar of fire at night. And both were continually before them, guiding their path. God's presence was visible, yet always from a distance. And when I read these passages, I kind of get in my mind something like a rainbow. I don't care how bright and brilliant that rainbow is, you can't ever get very close to it. The closer you walk to it, it seems the further it gets away from you. And this is the kind of the idea I have of the pillar of smoke, or the pillar of clouds and the pillar of fire. They could only get so close to it, and it just kept moving away from them. God wanted them to experience an even closer and more intimate presence than these columns. So he asked them to build for him a portable tabernacle. This tabernacle would be placed at the very center or the very heart of their camp. Everybody could be there to look in and see that tabernacle. And this holy tabernacle with the ark would be God's new dwelling place among them. They could not miss it, and they could walk up to it. God is now close and real for them. His presence is mediated by the priest. These priests taught Israel how to worship God in all his holiness. in the tabernacle. The priest led Israel before God in praise, sacrifice, and offering there at the tabernacle. These priests were laying the foundation for God's holy temple to be built in the land of promise. This personal devotion to God was teaching this next generation the importance of worship in staying in contact, in intimate relationship with their God. What are lessons can we learn from this Old Testament event of the wilderness experience? Well, if you look around us, we know that we live in a barren spiritual wasteland or wilderness. And God is teaching His people, the church, the same learning curve to prepare His people to enter that land of promise for all eternity. In essence, their experience is our experience. Because God is teaching each one of us to learn to depend upon Him. He's teaching us dependence, which is kind of difficult. Remember, we can be as stubborn as mules. And we love our independence. We want to do it for ourselves. And we do a pretty good job at it, at the exclusion of God. But our dependence is everything that we have belongs to God that He has provided for us. You wonder why He wants us to give back to Him? It is in recognition that He gave and we are to return. God is also teaching us obedience, which sometimes is pretty hard as well. For a couple of reasons, it becomes hard for us in the church to be obedient. First, our generation of the church does not know what God is telling us because we don't know His Word. We don't spend a lot of time with Him learning what His expectation is from us. And then, it's hard for us because it's easier to do what we want. And when we do what we want, we think we feel better. So obedience, we're still learning that obedience as God's people as a way to prepare us to enter the promised land for all eternity. And God is teaching His people right now His presence, which is kind of tough. We have a lot of distractions in this world. There is a lot of noise out there clamoring for our attention. So it's hard for us in this spiritual wilderness to keep focused on God in our worship and our devotion. But remember, God is preparing us to enter that promised land for all eternity. Even though we are in a barren spiritual wasteland, God is using and preparing each one of us as His people to march very confidently and victoriously to all eternity. As a community of faith in the world, God is trying to mold, trying to shape, trying to develop a very stubborn people to become worthy of their calling in Jesus Christ, that we might live like Him for the glory of God.